welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Now, we're going to be discussing Weimar, the German hyperinflation of 1922-23, in particular for some weeks, because we've got to see that this is very likely the political situation opening up in front of us. The United States has very little experience of hyperinflation. You had the Continentals during the American Revolution, a currency that depreciated significantly. Had some greenback hyperinflation. Well, some greenbacks in the Civil War depreciated, never really getting to hyperinflation. Where you did have it was Confederate money. The Confederate money did go to hyperinflation in the South during the Civil War. Otherwise, we haven't had it. What we've had, and this is an interesting calculation, if you do the calculation of inflation based on postage stamps, you will see that in 1960, it was a 4-cent first-class mail fee, so a 4-cent stamp, and in 2009, it's a 44-cent stamp. So we've had inflation of 1,000%. Your dollar today is worth 9 cents, approximately. And this means that we've had at least 1,000% over 50 years, which is significant, but I think this is a lowball estimate because it doesn't really tell you about the really expensive things like college education, medical insurance, liability insurance. It doesn't say anything about the lengthening of the work day, the work week, and the work year. But what you see is that already, even over the past decade or two, we've got the typical politics of Weimar hyperinflation. In other words, certain classes lose and they become more and more bitter, and because they don't understand economics, they tend to blame other groups in the society. Sometimes they get it wrong. The people who are not speculators are looking around for scapegoats, right, because they're losing. Remember also that based on what we have in the calculation in Surviving the Cataclysm, which you can get from Amazon.com, we've lost 2/3 of the U.S. standard of living over about that same almost 50-year period. So now, let's look at Germany. We're talking about Germany defeated in World War I, right? We're talking about 1919, 20, 21, 22, 23. They had to pay huge amounts of reparations. We've also got as Hjalmar Schacht points out, this is Schacht writing in 1928 when he's still apparently a Democrat, the German Democratic Party, the ancestor of the Free Democrats of today. Campaigns of naked shorting, that is to say, bare speculation with no cover against the German mark. Now, that's the international economic warfare of the British and the French, assisted by private interests, of course, but naked, bare speculation against the mark and campaigns of assassination, in particular the assassination of the very distinguished foreign minister Walter Rathenau, Rathenau, in June of 1922, which is the kickoff for this inflation. Let's just give you an idea. Before World War I, it was about 4.2 marks to a dollar, I believe, and then by June of 1922, it was 345 marks to a dollar. But the big crash into hyperinflation begins as soon as Rathenau was assassinated, between the end of June and the end of July of 1922. It goes from 345 marks to 670 marks to the dollar. So it's practically 100% inflation in 1 month. So you're losing 3 to 4% of your money per day. That gets you and that's only the beginning of hyperinflation. Ultimately, it is a 1 trillion to 1 hyperinflation, 1914 to late November, and actually worse, as you can read in Surviving the Cataclysm, because those are official rates, not street rates. The several accounts of this that I'm going to be talking about. One is by Bresciani Turoni. Bresciani Turoni was the Italian representative on the Reparations Commission in Berlin, and he points out the depreciation of the mark, the hyperinflation of the mark, between 1914 and 1923 is one of the outstanding episodes in the history of the 20th century. It was the most colossal thing of its kind in history. In other words, it's the biggest hyperinflation in world history, and second only to World War I itself. It must bear responsibility for many of the political and economic difficulties of the interwar generation. And Barishani Toroni says, if we are to plan for greater stability in the future, we must learn to avoid the mistakes from which this hyperinflation sprang. All right, good. That's what we're trying to do. So, at a certain point, the money begins to lose value. Now, today, of course, it's the $4 to $5 trillion dollar overhang out in the world. This is what I wrote about in that article that you could see at Act Independent, and the interview I did with Russia Today. You got an overview of this, and we've talked about it earlier in the program. Certain classes always lose, certain classes always gain. The ones who lose are the majority, right? Who loses? Anybody on a fixed income. And that meant anybody with a government job, anybody who was a government official, anybody who lived on a pension, an annuity, things like Social Security in those days. Now, of course, today there's a cost of living escalator, but the problem with those is that they don't go fast enough. They're not frequent. The adjustment is not frequent enough to deal with something like 3 to 4% per day. The basic rule of hyperinflation is that physical economy takes its revenge against the paper economy, because when you get hyperinflation, everything based on paper becomes completely worthless very, very quickly, wasting assets converging on zero in their value. Stocks, bonds, pensions to the extent that they're fixed incomes, annuities, all of these become worthless. So the whole world of Wall Street paper is absolutely wiped out, completely wiped out. Now, the German economy in those days was far less financialized than the U.S. economy of today, far greater proportional share of industry in Germany at that time. But what hyperinflation does, it is the triumph, the revenge of material values, the so-called Sachwerte, material values, physical commodities. These go up in value as the value of the money goes down. And the whole trick of hyperinflation is, if you get any paper money, get rid of it instantly, buy anything you can, anything physical, even if it's something you don't need, because you can barter that later on. Now, a couple of comments here. Rathenau, on the eve of his assassination, commented that Germany was like a person who was not crazy, a sane man who, however, had been locked in an insane asylum, who gradually assimilated the mental illnesses of the inmates that he was forced to live with. Now, this would be, the American people have been forced into 401ks. They've been forced into IRAs because the defined benefit plans have died out. The risk has been shifted to you. If we get health savings accounts, the risk will be shifted to you even more. The Wall Street insanity has infected this entire society. In the hyperinflation, one of the ways you see it in the 1920s, there's no demand for the treasury securities of the German government. The treasury securities of the German government become essentially unmarketable, and the only group that's buying them is the Reichsbank, the central bank itself. Now, remember, the U.S. is selling $400 billion of treasury bonds per month. So who's going to buy them? Eventually, it may well be the Federal Reserve that is going to buy them. During hyperinflation, and this is extremely important, it's perfectly possible to have hyperinflation going on and no credit available for industry. In other words, the entire lending market, as we have now in the U.S., can dry up, and there's still no credit for industry. And above all, what one of the characters in Pearl Buck's report about this period says, it's all very well to go with the reactionaries, right, the Republicans, but if you go with the reactionaries against the workers, then at the end of the day, the reactionaries will swallow you up. So what I'll be doing is giving you a